describes being hopeless. What strength do I have that I should still hope? What prospects that I should be patient? Chapter 7, verse 3, his suffering feels pointless. I've been allotted months of futility, nights of misery have been assigned to me. Chapter 7, verse 7 is despair. He says, my eyes will never see happiness again. That's what it feels like when you're suffering. You can't imagine a future which is better than today. And the desire for assisted suicide is so often tied up with a lack of hope that things will ever get better. Later in chapter 29, Job laments how the best years of his life are behind him. He says, oh, for the days when I was in my prime. He reflects how he accomplished so much in his life. He was respected by everyone who knew him. But that's all in the past. And again, that's a message you hear in the assisted suicide debate. Best years of your life are behind you. You've got nothing left to live for. Put it all together, you feel the weight of Job's grief, don't you? Chapter 6, verse 8, he longs for God to take his life. He says, oh, that I might have my request, that God would grant what I hope for, that God would be willing to crush me, to let loose his hand and cut off my life. Or chapter 7, verse 15, this is particularly shocking. He says, I prefer strangling and death to this body of mine. He would prefer a gruesome death to continued existence. Anything to end the suffering. Although no, Job doesn't take his own life or ask his friends to do it for him. See, the Bible isn't indifferent to the problem of suffering. It gives us words to describe it. It gives us permission to rage against it and complain to God about it. So what's wrong with the we need it argument? The reality is that we need something else. Ending someone's life is not the big win that some people seem to think it is. What we need instead is improved palliative care. This is something we at Care have campaigned on for years. Palliative care is the end-of-life care that's given to a person who's dying. It's medical, it's trying to ease pain, make them comfortable, but it's also emotional, spiritual, relational. It's looking to help people prepare for death in every way. Pioneered as a medical discipline by a Christian, Dame Cicely Saunders. And she encapsulates the message behind palliative care like this. She says, you matter. You matter because you are you, and you matter to the last moment of your life, and we will do all we can to make that life as good as we can. That's what palliative care is about. That's what we need. And palliative care does work. I've spoken with many palliative care nurses, and in most cases, pain can be managed. Death can be dignified. One nurse told me in 25 years of palliative care, she can count on one hand the number of people who died in particularly distressing ways. More investment is needed in palliative care. It's a little bit of a postcode lottery at the moment. You know why we have so many hospice charity shops. It's because palliative care is not properly funded. But that's another reason not to legislate assisted suicide, because in every other country that's legalized it, funding has dropped for palliative care afterwards. So the first strand of the argument is all about compassion. In the name of compassion for the suffering, we need this law. But actually, compassion doesn't mean taking someone's life. Compassion means walking with them, standing alongside them, caring for them, right to the end. Next slide, let's move on to a second strand of argument that was heard in the debate. It's that we should legalize assisted suicide because we want it. This is the autonomy argument. Why shouldn't we be able to choose when we die? I'm the master of my fate, I'm the captain of my soul. Let's say I don't believe in God. Who are you to deny me the right to choose to end my life when I want? It's like the argument many used when same-sex marriage was legalized. If you don't believe in same-sex marriage, don't have one. Don't stop me from having one. And now they're saying, if you don't believe in assisted suicide, don't do it. Don't stop me from doing it. autonomy and choice, they're good things, aren't they? In almost every area of life, we do have choice. We have choices about who to marry, choices about where to live, choices about what to do for work. In the medical sphere, we have freedom to refuse certain treatments. We have choice. But in today's post-Christian world, autonomy and choice have become distorted. They're now seen as ultimate rather than as good things given to us by God. The word choice or choose was used 128 times in the last parliamentary debate about assisted suicide. My choice has now become king. And that means that autonomy and choice are really difficult arguments to stand against. You sound really narrow and restrictive when you talk about limiting choice, but actually we limit choice all the time, don't we? I'm not free to do anything I want, certainly without legal consequence. I'm not free to drive home tonight at 110 miles an hour unless I want a driving ban. Because we limit choice in the interest of public safety. I'm not free to take certain illegal drugs. I'm not free to sell one of my kidneys to the highest bidder, even if I need the money and they're willing to pay. Not free to do that. I'm not free to fight you to the death in a duel, even if you want to fight me too. We restrict freedom all the time. It's necessary for society to function. So why is autonomy gaining so much traction in this area? Why do we believe so strongly, or why do some people believe so strongly in our choice to have a doctor help me commit suicide? I think the answer to that is fear. Fear of suffering, fear of pain, fear of loss of control, fear of death. Who wants to be against freedom and choice and autonomy? Well, if we care about the vulnerable, and if we care about the shape and values of our society, we have to say no to some freedoms and some choices. Because it's not just about giving choice to some people to end their lives if they want to. By giving the choice to some, you are in fact forcing that choice upon all. Now, if this is passed, everybody will have to ask, everyone in the hospital will have to ask, am I being selfish by continuing to live? Am I taking up NHS resources that could be used for someone else? Am I being a burden on my family? Everybody with a terminal illness will now need to answer those questions. It's not just giving a choice to some, it's saying everybody needs to make that choice. And then you get the unspoken pressure that comes with that choice. It's almost like a self-coercion, if you like. One journalist wrote in the Times last year, he's writing in favour of assisted suicide, he's a supporter, and he made a prediction. He said, social pressure will grow on the terminally ill to hasten their own deaths, so as not to be a burden on others. Your time is up will never be an order, but it may one day be the kind of unspoken hint that everyone understands. It's amazing he wrote that. Most people on the other side aren't that honest. But he's right. That if you legalize this, it's that unspoken pressure that will come on so many people. There's all sorts of other unintended consequences of assisted suicide. It changes certain dynamics in healthcare. Cost becomes a bigger factor in whether treatment is available. That impacts others. Mental health. We've come so far in raising awareness about mental health and suicide. Evidence shows that when assisted suicide is legalized in a country, unassisted suicide, traditional suicide, also increases. See, giving people a choice here impacts others. You get into the bizarre situation where you do everything you can to even physically intervening and risking our own lives to stop some people killing themselves, but for others you say, well, we'll help you do it. Giving people a choice affects those with disabilities. One Canadian has written about how he's got this neurodegenerative disability. He's written about how he faces neglect, denial of some of his essential care. He's He's often told by doctors his care needs are too much and he should have euthanasia instead. And his fight to access the level of care he is entitled to has become harder since Canada introduced euthanasia. Because your choice has that wider impact. Your choice affects those who are vulnerable to coercion. This autonomy argument, we want it, it falls down because no man's an island. The decisions we make affect others. One more strand to the argument before I'll pass it back to you. One more strand to the argument in favour of assisted suicide. Next slide. That is that we can control it. So campaigners say we recognise that this is something that could be open to abuse if not done properly. We've heard stories from other nations, but we've got the right safeguards. If we do this our way, the law will never be abused, it will never be misused, it won't be a slippery slope. We've been told this law has the strictest safeguards of any assisted suicide law in the world. Two problems with that. One is that it's not true, and the other was, even if it were true, those safeguards would always get eroded over time because, well, they've actually even been eroded in the last few weeks as the requirement for a High Court judge has been dropped. The reality is that, actually, no, we can't control it. Slippery slope arguments get a bad reputation. A bad slippery slope argument assumes that stepping onto the slippery slope guarantees slippage to the bottom. Good slippery slope argument asks, well, what restraints are there that would stop us from slipping further? Are there any restraints? So once you've introduced assisted suicide, let's say for people who have got less than 6 months to live, what's the restraint that would stop you slipping further to a year? To 2 years? There's no real difference, is there? There's no logical difference. So what happens is you move a bit further down the slope. Well, what happens when the court case is brought by the person who has a lifelong condition but it's not terminal? This happened in 2021 in Canada. Some people with disabilities filed a lawsuit saying they were being discriminated against because they didn't have the same rights as people who were already dying. And they won the case. There wasn't really a strong argument to stop you slipping down the slope, and so they slid a bit further. And that's happened in every country that has legalised assisted suicide. In the Netherlands, the law started with having an incurable illness causing unbearable suffering, but now people get euthanasia for loneliness or autism. If you want to think more about how safeguards don't protect the disabled, I encourage you to watch Liz Carr's documentary on BBC iPlayer. It's called Better Off Dead. Really helpful. There's going to be expansion of the criteria because any limits are, by their nature, arbitrary. So what are the safeguards that are in this bill that's currently before Parliament? Well, they're not that strong. One of the safeguards in the bill is that this procedure is only for those with less than 6 months left to live. But of course, how can you predict that? Predicting how long someone has to live is notoriously difficult. Some people who are given that prediction are alive decades later. What other safeguards have they promised us? Well, there's nothing in the bill about what happens if the family thinks someone is facing undue pressure. So in the bill, there's a right of appeal. If you apply for assisted suicide and they say no, and the panel says no, but if you are worried that your mother or father or sibling is being coerced or pressured, there's no way family members can appeal. In fact, there's no requirement for family even to be informed. Nothing to stop doctors initiating conversations about assisted suicide. In Australia, doctors are not allowed to raise the subject with patients, precisely because of that subtle coercive pressure when someone in authority says to you, have you thought about ending your own life? They say that to you just after you've had a horrible diagnosis. Immediately you're thinking, oh, should I? Is that what the doctor thinks I should do? So in Australia, the doctors are not allowed to raise it first with you. In the UK bill, a doctor can say it to you any time they like. There are reports from Canada of disabled people who feel pressured into it because they are told so often by hospital staff that they should consider it. There's other problems with the bill. At CARE, we're working with MPs to try and stop the bill from passing. We're working with those MPs who've said they're undecided. But also we're saying if it's going to pass, we're trying to make this the least bad version of the bill possible. I don't think there's any safeguards that can make it safe, but we can make it better than it is. Let me finish this point with some words from a Christian MP. I've mentioned him already, Danny Kruger. His speech in the debate in November is so powerful. He said this, I'm talking about the people who lack agency, the people who know what it is to be excluded from power, to have decisions made for them by bigwigs they don't understand. Not the ones who write to us campaigning for a change in the law, but the people who come to us with their lives in tatters, or who the police and social workers tell us about, the people with complex needs. What are the safeguards for them, he asked. I will tell you, we are the safeguard. This parliament, this place, you and me, we are the people who protect the most vulnerable in society from harm. Let us pray that our MPs remember that responsibility before they vote again later in the spring. We've covered the negative, but Christians, we need not just to say what we're against, but also what we're for. So in our second half, we're going to focus on the better story the church can tell. But before we go any further, I'd love to do another discussion question. So next slide, let's put that on the screen. What are some specific ways we can communicate the Christian view of life and dignity in conversations about assisted suicide? So you're chatting to someone who's not a Christian, perhaps, undecided. What are some specific things you might want to say? Take a few minutes and see what you come up with. Wrap up those thoughts. And I'd love to hear again what you came up with. If anyone came up with anything really helpful, how do we communicate the Christian view of life and dignity in our conversations? Who wants to go first?
Communicating the care that we have for older people, disabled people, and anyone in that. So we need to keep communicating the value of their life.
Yeah, so those who the world sees as less, who are likely to kind of look down on, and so we need to go over and above and beyond, and say we are going to value you and care for you, the elderly, the disabled, whoever else. It's brilliant. Yeah. Anyone else?
The sad thing is that they think by ending their life, they're ending their pain and suffering, but if they're not Christians, they're going to a far worse suffering, aren't they?
And so we want, and we'll come to this in a minute, we want to be communicating the gospel as well. It's not just about being against assisted suicide. We are for eternal life, aren't we? That's not an argument we're making in Parliament at the moment. But MPs they're not going for that argument. Anyone else? How else do you talk about this with people? I heard you were all talking lots. I'm sure you got some more ideas.
Yeah. God created us a fundamental right to live.
Yeah.
No one should take.
Yeah, he created us. He gives us life, and yeah, spot on. Yeah. Let's get one more.
I just saw this chap. Well, was I in God's image?
Yeah.
I don't mind saying that. I don't probably wouldn't mean anything. They wouldn't hear it.
Yeah, you made God's image, and that means what? You have value. You have dignity and honor. You are not just to be disposed of when your life seems not to have any value anymore, because you always have value. In this next section, I'm going to give you a few ideas of my own. It's the better story that the church can tell. So next slide. Christians have been accused of imposing their morality on this debate, as if we've got this horrible, restrictive mindset. And far from it. We have a view about God and life that is good and beautiful and true. And so here, I'm going to give us some ways to talk to our neighbours and our friends that point to the goodness of the Christian worldview. You don't need to remember them all in order. They're different angles. You can pick and choose them at different times. Number one, in the Christian story, we recognise that it's for God to give and take life. This isn't a power he has given to us, and that's really good. So Hannah sings about this in 1 Samuel chapter 2. The Lord brings death and makes alive. We do not. This is at the heart of the 6th commandment. You shall not murder. There are 3 instances in the Bible where someone asks another human to take their life. None of them are portrayed positively. You're wondering which ones they are. Jonah, I wouldn't really call that assisted suicide or euthanasia, so let's leave that to one side. Second one is Abimelech. His story is in the book of Judges. They're laying siege to a tower, and we're told a woman dropped a millstone on his head and cracked his skull. Hurriedly, he called to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and kill me, so that they can't say a woman killed him." So his servant ran him through, and he died. So he's dying anyway, assisted suicide. But remember that the general rule of thumb is that if they do it in Judges, it's probably not a good thing. The last one's King Saul, mortally wounded. He asked his servant to end his suffering by running him through with a sword. The servant refuses. Later, though, an Amalekite claims to have done the deed. He recounts, probably untruthfully, but he says, "Saul said to me, 'Stand here and kill me. I'm in the throes of death, but I'm still alive. So I killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen, he could not survive.'" But the Amalekite, he's not then praised for his mercy and compassion, but condemned as guilty of murder. It's for God to give and take life. And that's actually, this is really a good thing. We've already talked about this. By giving some people a choice, you're making everyone make a choice. And choosing the moment of death may be a goal for some rich celebrities, but it's a burden we were not meant to bear. It's too heavy for most of us to carry. How am I going to make that decision? You know, we may question God's timing. We may not understand God's plan, but surely we can see God's goodness in not giving us the power to choose when our lives should end. Another angle, next slide. In the Christian story, we believe every life has value. We say, whoever you are valuable because you're made in the image of God. You may be disabled, you may be suffering, your best years may be behind you, but you have been crowned with glory and honor by the Lord himself. And in fact, those who are seen as weaker are to be shown greater honor and dignity in God's economy. Whoever you are, you have something to offer. You are part of us. See, the message of assisted suicide is that for some people, it would be good for you not to exist. Due to the circumstances you're in, it would be good if your life was over. And the knock-on effect of this is it leads us to reduce the value of some people in our minds. It brings to the forefront the thought, if I was in your shoes, I'd want to die. Your life is worth less. It's really depressing. In countries that have legalized assisted suicide or euthanasia, popular support has risen for expanding it to the disabled, the homeless, to drug addicts. It reinforces this idea that some lives aren't worth so much. Christians, we say the opposite. We say nobody's ever passed their sell-by dates. Everybody has value. Everybody should be loved. You matter because you are you. You matter until the last moment of your life. Linked to that, part 3, the Christian story, another way we can tell it. It's a story where we bear one another's burdens. Let me tell you about Nola. Nola was CEO of Care for many years. Her husband Tony got Alzheimer's, slowly deteriorated for years until he died. And there were times the suffering was immense, but also times of sweet connection. And Nola said afterwards, "I'm so proud that I got to care for him every step of the way." If you want to think more about that, check out Tony's story on the Care website. But we come into the world as burdens. We leave the world as burdens. And at various times in our lives, we bear one another's burdens. I would love us to commit as a people never to say to one another, "I don't want to be a burden." Let me tell you about Rosina. She lived in Canada. She was lonely, isolated. She had fibromyalgia, various psychiatric disorders. She didn't technically qualify for euthanasia. Her disability benefits were so low that she couldn't get pain medication and she didn't have adequate housing. She applied for assisted suicide. Even though she didn't qualify, she was approved and killed a few days later. Later, a friend found a note from her. This is what she said: "The suffering I experience is mental, not physical. Constant worrying about not having food to eat. I think if more people cared about me, I might be able to handle the suffering caused by my physical illness." She have people to bear burdens with her. If this passes, Christians are going to need to think more and more about how we love our neighbour. How can we love our neighbours in ordinary ways and creative ways? How can we love the weak, love the elderly, love our parents, love the vulnerable, so that for them at least assisted suicide becomes unthinkable? We may not always have the right things to say, but we can be there with them, loving them, bearing their burdens. Let's be good at doing that. Part 4, in the Christian story, we stand up for the vulnerable. Proverbs 31 tells us, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy. Sometimes you hear that thing, Christians shouldn't impose their morality. Stop imposing your morality. I think that argument's ridiculous. There's all sorts of areas I won't try and impose what I believe, but when it comes to speaking up for the vulnerable, absolutely I will. It's Christians seeking to impose their morality that ended the gladiatorial games and all those thousands upon thousands of people killed. Christians seeking to impose their morality that made it illegal to have sex with children. Christians seeking to impose their morality that ended the slave trade. Our morality tells us that every life has value, every life should be protected, and somehow in public debate, some people are asking us to feel ashamed of that. So Christians imposing their morality when it comes to protecting the weak and the vulnerable, count me in. Last one. One more way to tell the Christian story. We can give people hope. We must give people hope. Again, remember Job. He said, my eyes will never see happiness again. Hopelessness. Now, in his case, physically and emotionally, life got better. And sometimes today, people are given that terminal diagnosis, 6 months left to live, and they're still going strong 5 years later. Let me tell you about Alison. Alison suffered throughout her life. She was born with spina bifida, she used a wheelchair, she was doubly incontinent, constantly nauseous, she had osteoporosis, which caused broken bones, she had frequent infections. Sometimes she said the pain was so bad that she couldn't move or speak or even think. One point in her 30s, she was given that life expectancy of less than 6 months. And she said at the time, I wish assisted suicide was legal, as she would have taken it. That was back in the 80s. She lived another 20 years. And she discovered in those 20 years a will to live, not die. After visiting a project for disabled children in South India, she set up a charity. She went on to support hundreds of disabled children and adults, and she commented, had euthanasia or assisted suicide been legal, I would have missed the best years of my life. See, at that time she was hopeless. But she kept going, and then she discovered hope. She felt that advocates of assisted suicide were motivated by what she called false compassion. She said true compassion means immersing yourself in the suffering of others, not in ending their suffering by ending their lives. Compassion does not tell suffering people that their situation is hopeless, but demonstrates hope by pledging never to abandon them. So she lived another 20 years after that 6 months to live diagnosis. But even when that isn't the case, when it is a decline unto death, hope is still important. The Christian hope is that this life is not all there is. That eternity awaits and you will be raised with a new glorified body. So we read from Job at his lowest, but listen where Job goes. He says in chapter 19, I know that my Redeemer lives. And in the end, he will stand on the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes. So he goes from my eyes will never see happiness again to in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes. Assisted suicide feeds on hopelessness, that this is all there is and it's only getting worse. Assisted suicide says, in your moment of hopelessness, we're going to let you go. Christians, let's tell a story of hope. Tell of the promise that one day he will wipe every tear from every eye. And there'll be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain. And until that day, we offer you hope. So let's have confidence to tell our better story to the world. In a moment, we'll have time for questions, but one more section briefly, and that is your part in the story. There are two things we're asking you to do. Number one is pray. Oh, if we go back there, there you go. Pray for your MP. On a previous version of the slide, it said pray to your MP. Please don't do that. Proverbs 21 tells us that in the Lord's hand, the king's heart is a stream of water. He turns it whichever way he wants. Your MP's heart is a stream of water. When Daniel faced great trials in Babylon, what did he and his friends do? They prayed. We believe in the God of the book of Esther, who was able to turn expected political outcomes on their head, a 180-degree reversal in a single night. So pray for parliaments, pray for your local MP, pray for those involved in the campaign. Pick up a leaflet from that stand that says 7 ways to pray about assisted suicide. And number 2 is write to your MP. Well, on this topic, unlike many others, MPs are open to having their minds changed. At CARE, we're working with what we're calling the in-betweeners, those who think that we think they're open to having their minds changed. We're working with them particularly. A lot of MPs are unsettled by the way that the safeguards, such as the High Court judge, have been eroded before the bill's even been passed. So where we're standing now, the MP here is Seema Malhotra. You may have a different one. Ruth Cadbury is also an MP nearby. Seema Malhotra voted against the bill in November. Ruth Cadbury voted for it. They will both have another vote later in the spring. Write to them. Write letters full of grace and truth, overflowing with the fruit of the Spirit. On CARE's website, we've got a section about how you can write to your MP, or you can use your notes from tonight, or do more research from our website, or write your own letter, whatever you want. But do write to them. That does really make a difference. Let me finish with a Bible verse and then a quote. Daniel's friends went into the fiery furnace, saying that God was able to save them. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. God's able to defeat this vote. God's able to defeat this vote, 650 MPs to 0. But even if he does not, we don't need to despair. We as Christians are called to be faithful, to love our neighbour. So next slide. An American theologian, Stanley Hauerwas, writes this: I say, in 100 years, if Christians are known as a strange group of people who don't kill their children and don't kill the elderly, we will have done a great thing. That may not sound like much, but if we can be a community who, through the worship of God, is ready to be hospitable to new life and life that is suffering, then that is a political alternative that otherwise the world will not have. Next slide. Thank you so much for listening, for your attention, and for your answers earlier. I'd love to take your questions. Any questions on any aspect of anything we've talked about tonight, or indeed any other part of CARE's work. I love questions. They can be sometimes they can be part of the most fun part of the evening. So please do stick your hand up in the air and see what you've got. Yes.
It's another huge subject that seems to me very much a parallel with this, and that's abortion.
Yes.
Because I can remember when it was brought in many years ago,